Welcome back everyone to another reaction video. Well, today we're diving into a very popular channel, but one that I have never reacted to before. This is History Hit. History Hit has over 1.3 million subscribers, almost 1.4 million now, and it's a channel that I have watched personally many times, but I've never actually watched this particular video, which is kind of surprising because it's a topic that I am very interested in. And this video is called 10 Big Myths of World War I. We've done some other videos over time about myths about World War I, and this is a topic that's kind of in my wheelhouse. I've been studying a lot over the last couple of years. I got to appear on a History Channel documentary about World War I, so I'll put the link down in the description. If you're not familiar with History Hit, definitely a channel worth checking out. Dan Snow is one of my favorite presenters when it comes to history. I think he does a fantastic job. So this should be interesting, and I'll try to let each one of these play out before I stop and comment on it, but I can't guarantee that. I get a little antsy and sometimes like to jump in. So let's go ahead and dive into this one.
The First World War is widely regarded as a pointless, horrific, murderous, uniquely hideous conflict. It's almost become a symbol of tragedy, of futility, of disaster.
Yeah.
Now, don't get me wrong. The First World War was hell on earth. But so is the trench warfare in eastern Ukraine today, the street fighting in Bakhmut.
He's actually making a great point there. I mean, there are a lot of similarities going on right now in eastern Ukraine with the Russian invasion there that harken back to the First World War. And you have new things, as in every war, there are new technologies being deployed on the battlefield that we haven't seen in huge numbers before, like drones, for example. The drone warfare that's going on, it reminds me a lot of what you see in World War I, where you have new things like poison gas being used in major ways, and trench mortars being used, and machine guns deployed in the largest numbers we've ever seen, stuff like that.
And so was Napoleon's Russian campaign of 1812, when the vast majority of his troops starved. World War I was not uniquely awful, but we've come to believe in several powerful myths about that war. We shouldn't fall for them. If we do, we risk minimizing the experience of soldiers and civilians caught up in countless other appalling conflicts throughout history and the present day. So I'm going to take a look at the myths and explain the reality. Let's go.
So he makes a good point there, and let's just point out that in highlighting how horrific the Great War was at times, he's right. We shouldn't therefore think it's uniquely horrific in ways that other wars haven't been, because every war has its horror about it. I mean, the Gulf War, which was the first war that I kind of experienced in my life in a major way, that at least my country was involved in. I was about 13 when that all went down, 12, 13 years old. It wasn't very horrific for the Americans, but if you were on what they call the highway of death and you were an Iraqi soldier, it was hell on earth. So it depends on your perspective. It depends on a lot of different factors.
It was history's bloodiest war. Nope. The Second World War was far more costly. World War I wasn't even the bloodiest at that point in history.
And I want to stop right there. I know I said I would wait, but I want to highlight this because a lot of times when people say things like that, we immediately jump on them. Let's say, for example, World War I had been the bloodiest war to that point, which it wasn't. The Chinese civil wars were worse, and certainly worse in terms of percentage of the population. But a lot of times when people say things like it was the bloodiest war in history, we should add the caveat to that point, because oftentimes it was true at the time, but then something else came along that was worse. In this case, it wasn't even true at the time.
Half a century before the First World War, China was torn apart by an even bloodier conflict. Estimates of the dead in the 14-year Taiping Rebellion go as high as 30 million. Around 10 million soldiers were killed during the First World War, with perhaps the same number of civilians, so not as many as the Taiping Rebellion. Although around 900,000 Brits died in the First World War, more than any other conflict for which we have reliable data, we think the bloodiest war in British history relative to population size are the civil wars
Yep.
of the mid-17th century. Less than 2% of the British population died in World War I. By contrast, we think 4% of the population of England and Wales, and considerably more than that in Scotland and Ireland, are thought to have died during the civil wars. During the 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 48, millions died in Europe, perhaps 20% of the entire population. Now, the French lost an appalling 1.4 million men in the war, 20% of those who served. But this figure of 1.5 million is what some historians believe the French also lost in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars of 1792 to
When their population was
1815.
lower.
The American losses for World War I are around 110,000, less than 20% of Americans killed during the Civil War.
But there's one thing I do want to highlight about that last statistic, and that is, first of all, the 110,000 Americans who died, about half of those were battle deaths. The other half were from disease and accident, things like that. A lot of it from the Spanish flu, which American troops probably brought to the Western Front, which is a considerably higher percentage of deaths by disease compared to a lot of other nations, and that's because Americans came in right at the very end. And so a lot higher percentage of American deaths came as a result of the flu pandemic. But of those 50,000 or so American deaths, half of those were just in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which is in like the last 6 weeks of the war. So though obviously Americans by comparison lost comparatively few, it was a really high percentage in the last couple of weeks. And a lot of that had to do with just Americans not knowing how to fight the war and how aggressive they were, because they kind of came in at the last minute. But yeah, everything else he said is absolutely true. It's all relative, right? You know, when we talk about losses, it depends on what nation you were. If you're Serbia in the First World War, it absolutely was the bloodiest war in your history. If you are a nation like France, you're looking at the Napoleonic Wars being worse. If you're China, obviously you have a very different perspective on what bloody wars are, because even in World War II, the civilian deaths are just ridiculous in China. If you're the Soviets, your World War II losses are by far worse than anybody else's. So it's all relative. It all depends on your perspective. Is World War I one of the bloodiest wars in human history? Absolutely. Why do we think it's the bloodiest? Because it happened mostly in Europe. Most of those deaths happened in Europe. And because we are Western here in America and English-speaking people, we tend to focus more on European history and on Western history.
Most of the troops who fought were killed.
I've never heard that myth.
No, they weren't. The vast majority of those who fought came home. And I'm not belittling the fact that, of course, huge numbers of survivors had lifelong mental and physical injuries. But there are many examples in the history of campaigns in which most soldiers did not survive. That's traditionally because armies had lost many more men to disease and hunger than they had to enemy action. This was still true in the First World War for the Americans, but not for other nations. In World War I, troops were now screened for tuberculosis. Efforts were made to ensure they had clean drinking water and careful management of human waste. Troops were better supplied with food and clothing, which could be carried on railways from industrial economies back home. Very different to previous centuries. Doctors in World War I had antiseptic, access to blood transfusion, and effective tetanus treatments. This meant that while a shocking number of men were killed in battle, the majority of men were able to survive through their years of service and even survive terrible wounds which would have killed them a few generations before. In the UK, around 6 million men were mobilised, of which around 11.5% were killed.
Which is a crazy high number when you really think about it.
In fact, as a British soldier, you were more likely to die during the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856 than in the First World War. In the Crimea, the British lacked winter clothes to survive the cold Russian winter, and some starved due to lack of supplies. There were 2 million American troops in Europe. Of these, just 50,000 were killed in battle, and around 60,000 died of other causes, mostly the Great Influenza. So 95% of American servicemen went home.
Now, you want to compare that to something like if you were in the Grande Armée that marched with Napoleon into Russia, then you were more likely than not to never make it home. But yeah, I don't know that I've ever heard that myth, but I love how they presented all of that. I love the facts that they're using. And sometime over on the Stories of the Great War channel, we're going to have to do something kind of covering the whole process of treating a wounded soldier, because it was a complex series of things like advanced dressing stations and field hospitals, and then general hospitals that were back further behind the line. And we saw this at one of the museums that we went to over in Belgium, where they had the whole thing charted out, and they show you, if you're wounded on the front line, the process that you go through to get evacuated and to be treated at the front, to be brought back further, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a complex thing, and it's something that didn't necessarily exist through most of human history when it comes to warfare. And he's absolutely right. World War I is the first major conflict in Europe, certainly, where far more people died from battle wounds than from disease.
The rich commanded, the poor
No, not at all. Yeah.
This is way too simplistic. The great majority of casualties in the First World War were from working classes, who made up the vast majority of the population. And it's also true that most of the generals were from affluent backgrounds, but there were exceptions. Britain's most senior soldier, Sir William Robertson, had been born into a working family. He worked as a footman, a servant in a big house before joining the army as a private, the lowest possible rank.
That's crazy.
In 1877. The US commander in Europe, John Pershing, was the son of a farmer and store owner. The children of the social and political elite did their fair share of dying and fighting too. In fact, they were hit disproportionately hard by World War I. These young, highly educated, motivated, indoctrinated young men provided the junior officers whose job it was to lead the way over the top and expose themselves to the greatest danger.
And I hope he shows a percentage here, because junior officers, when we're talking like lieutenants and lieutenants in the British Army and captains and things like that, ridiculously high casualty rate.
As an example to their men. Just over 11% of the British Army's ordinary soldiers were killed during the war, compared with 20% of its officers. The elite private school Eton, which produced an array of British prime ministers, alone lost more than 1,000 former pupils, 1 in 5 of those who served.
Wow.
One French general, Castelnau, lost 3 sons. A British general, Edmund Allenby, lost his only child in the trenches. UK wartime Prime Minister Herbert Asquith lost a son, while future Prime Minister Andrew Bonar Law lost 2 sons.
Yeah, and we actually visited the gravesite of Herbert Asquith's son over on my channel, Stories of the Great War. I have a link down in the description if you want to check that channel out. One of my most recent videos, which is Stories of the Fallen from the Somme. We visited Asquith's grave.
The future Prime Minister Winston Churchill led his men out on nighttime raids into no man's land, and famously never ducked when a bullet passed with a crack.
I think he was in, he commanded, I want to say Northumberland Fusiliers, but it might have been somebody different than that.
A later Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, lost 2 brothers. Another one was terribly wounded, and an uncle was captured.
Hope he mentions the Queen's brother.
Nor did being a general mean you were out of the action either. During the war, more than 200 British generals were killed, wounded, or captured.
I mention this all the time because I'm so tired of that old trope that these were lions led by donkeys and that the generals sat back in chateaus while their men did all the fighting. No, these generals, you got to remember, the #1 killer of soldiers on the battlefield on the Western Front was artillery. And artillery could hit you even if you weren't on the front line. And a lot of these generals were on the front line. If you were a brigade commander, you were right up there. A lot of these generals were killed by artillery at their headquarters. And they were not exempt just because they were from high status.
In percentage terms, 18% of British generals that served in World War I would lose their lives during...
You were safer if you were a private than if you were a general or any officer for that matter.
...the conflict. In just 9 days, in late September and early October 1914, 8 British generals were killed, wounded or captured. Senior commanders were expected to visit the front lines nearly every day. In battle, they were considerably closer to the action than generals are today. In October 1915, 3 senior generals were killed in the space of a week, prompting Britain's most senior soldier to order generals not to expose themselves to danger. The loss of leadership was disastrous for the formations they commanded.
Yeah, and he didn't mention it, but among those that were killed was the brother of the woman we know today as the Queen Mother. She was Queen Elizabeth II's mother. She was also Queen Elizabeth. She was queen when King George VI was the king, and her brother was killed fighting, I think, at Loos. So, yeah, we see people like that. We see a number of members of royal families who were killed in these battles. The Germans had the same situation.
It was all fought in France and Belgium.
And most of the Western Front was.
The fighting on the Western Front in France and Belgium ran from the summer of 1914 till the late autumn, the fall of 1918. There wasn't much movement, and it was the main focus of the British Army's effort. It was close to home. You could even hear the bombardments in southeast England.
Yep.
So not surprisingly, it looms very large in the British telling of the war. But the war was fought all over the world. The first shots were fired by Royal Navy ships in the Bahamas. The first shot a British soldier fired was Al-Haji Grunshi in West Africa. He was in the Gold Coast Regiment, and he fired at German forces while invading Togoland. The British attacked the Ottoman Empire in the Levant, eventually capturing what's now Israel, Jordan, and a bit of Syria. The Allies attacked Turkey in the Balkans, and eventually reached Istanbul. They also attacked Austria and northern Italy in the Balkans, and they fought an endless campaign against the Germans in East Africa. The Allies also received Japanese support to occupy German ports in China.
Yep.
And there was massive fighting on the Eastern Front between Austria and Germany and the Russian Empire. Nearly 2 million Russians and 1 million Austro-Hungarians would die on this front, more dead than France and Britain respectively. This was a much bloodier theatre with more movement than the Western Front.
I was going to say that one of the reasons why it's bloodier is you don't have you do have trench warfare, but you don't have the pretty much static nature of trench warfare that you have for most of the Western Front. First few months of 1914 and then a lot of 1918 involves a lot of movement on the Western Front, but you have that throughout the Eastern Front. And the Balkans were horribly bloody, and so was Isonzo, which is where a lot of the battles on the Italian front in the Alps are fought.
Churchill and others hoped that eventually pressure on these other fronts might weaken Germany
Gallipoli.
and avoid the necessity of defeating her main field army on the Western Front. Lots of senior military commanders disagreed. They argued that Germany had to be defeated where it was strongest. In the end, they were both right. The German army was forced to retreat through Belgium, and at the same time, Austria, Turkey, Bulgaria collapsed in the autumn of 1918 and had a major impact on the determination of the Germans to go on fighting. They were lions led by donkeys.
There you go.
This is one of the most famous sayings about the First World War. The idea is that these heroic, brave young men were slaughtered on the orders of incompetent old men. First of all, this quote was alleged to be a German general talking about the British, but in fact it was made up by a historian. The men were certainly lions, no question about that. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, men of the Sherwood Foresters overcame the odds to get into the German trenches. They were cut off, they were battered by counterattacks, they ran out of ammunition, they fought with shovels, knives and fists before being wiped out. A few survivors crawled back after nightfall. 80% of the unit was killed, wounded or captured.
And there are so many stories of like that just from the first day at the Somme. You could say the same thing about the Newfoundland Regiment. You could say the same thing about some of the Northumberland Fusiliers. that were attacking around La Boiselle. I mean, there's so many places where that was the case. And you could say the same thing about the French during the Battle of the Frontiers. And you could say that about the Germans and about the Serbians and the Italians and the Russians. But in all of those cases, there are heroic leaders that are doing amazing things. I mean, some of the generals in the old British Army that were fighting at the First Battle of Ypres in the fall of 1914, heroic last stands before being killed.
These men were definitely lions. And some of the leaders were donkeys. As in any organization, there are going to be a few useless people around. But there were lots of clever, talented men in senior positions in the various militaries wrestling with how to win this war. Naturally, some generals were not up to the job. The Italian Luigi Cardona sent his men time and again into battle with the same plan and the same bloody outcome. Russian Tsar Nicholas was pretty useless when he decided stupidly to take direct control of Russia's military effort. But in that, trust me, the First World War was no different to any war that has gone on before or has come
100%.
after. There were brilliant generals, such as Arthur Curry.
I was just going to say, the first person I would think of would be Arthur Curry. Arthur Curry was phenomenal. So was Monash. There's some great generals on the Western Front for the Allies.
Middle-class Canadian, failed insurance broker and property developer.
He was great.
His
Curry.
slogan was, "Pay the price of victory in shells, not lives." He saw the war would be won by the overwhelming application of firepower, behind which the well-trained and prepared troops could advance. He took advice from his excellent staff. He was never too grand to change his...
It's a picture there of him with Douglas Haig, who was the British commander-in-chief on the Western Front for the last few years of the war.
...mind. Men like him and the Australians, Sir John Monash,
there we go.
a new way of war in which tanks,
awesome general,
vehicles, planes and men move forward as one, helping each other, coordinating, overcoming challenges together. Rarely in history have commanders had to adapt to a more radically different technological environment. British commanders had been trained to fight small colonial wars. The American commander Pershing had fought as a young man against the Apache on the Great Plains. Now, they were thrust into a massive industrial struggle unlike anything they'd ever experienced.
Yeah, he's making a great point there. I mean, nobody was prepared for this kind of war. Some people adjusted well to it and they learned and they adapted. Others didn't. It didn't make them incompetent. It just meant that they didn't learn as well as others. And that's why many times you have that rise to the top. In the French army, you had some pretty incompetent commanders. In the German army, you had the same thing. And eventually the best do rise.
There was no more galloping across wide open space, searching for small groups of lightly armed but skilled warriors. War was now fought in massive defences, deep concrete bunkers, amid shattered muddy landscapes. Millions of men were now under their command. Thousands of planes and guns. Tanks and poison gas that appeared on the battlefield. Despite this, within 3 years, the British and the Americans had learned from their experience, and they learned from their allies and enemies alike, to effectively invent a new way of making war. By the summer of 1918, the British Army was probably at its best ever, and it inflicted a series of crushing defeats upon the Germans.
I notice he keeps specifically talking about the British and the Americans. He's very obviously gearing this toward a British and American audience, which makes sense. That's most of what my audience is as well.
Men were stuck in their trenches for years on end. The image we have of the First World War is that the soldiers lived for month after month in miserable trenches, partially flooded, awful smelling, under constant threat from the enemy in their trench, just a few hundred yards away across no man's land. The frontline trenches could be a terribly hostile place to live. Units, often wet, cold and exposed to the enemy, would lose their morale and suffer high casualties if they spent too much time in frontline trenches. As a result, the British Army rotated men in and out continuously. In normal times, between big battles, a unit spent perhaps 4 days a month in the front line trench, perhaps 8 days a month in the second and third line. The rest of the month, you might be training or labouring on new fortifications behind the lines. It was not unusual to be out of the line for a month. During moments of crisis, such as big offensives, the British occasionally could spend up to 7 days on the front line.
That's a very famous image right there, video image of men about to go over the top near Hawthorne Ridge on July 1st, 1916. Most of those men that you see in that image were dead within a half hour of this video being taken, and they're buried maybe 50 yards from where they're at right now in that sunken lane video.
But were far more often rotated out after just a day or two. When the men were behind the lines, they visited bars and brothels, they played sports, they even got to take leave in Britain.
Yeah, that's an excellent point on that one as well. And one of the, obviously there are a lot of negatives to trench warfare that we can all understand. But one of the positives to the lines being relatively static, except during great offensives or great battles, is that it allowed for you then to be able to rotate and pull guys off the front line. And you were scheduled. You knew when you were moving up. And so if you look at a map and you see, for example, okay, the 29th Division holds this sector right here. It doesn't mean the entire 29th Division. Let's say there's 20,000 men in the division. It doesn't mean there's 20,000 men on the front line. It might be 3,000 men on the front line at any given time in the trenches. You have your reserve trench. You have your secondary trench. You have guys back at places like Poppering, which was a town well behind the lines in the Ypres salient, where you had places like the Talbot House that people would go to. It was almost like a YMCA or like a USO kind of thing, where people would go and they would be able to relax and get a hot bath and have entertainment and get a drink. And they did start to understand the nature of psychological warfare as this went along, or psychology in warfare. They didn't necessarily understand things like PTSD as we know it today, but they did understand the importance of pulling guys off the line and giving them a rest, especially because of the nature of this war.
Nothing changed. Generals just tried the same old tactics again and again. It's true that some generals kept using the same old tactics, and their men paid for their commanders' lack of imagination in their blood. But the bigger story of the First World War is the extraordinary innovation.
Yeah.
Never have tactics and technology changed so radically in 4 years of fighting. In 1914, generals on horseback galloped across battlefields. The French wore red trousers. Soldiers on all sides wore cloth or leather hats rather than helmets. Soldiers
those Pickelhaube helmets that you see with the Germans with the spike on the top, those aren't metal. Those are leather. They look metal, but they're not.
In straight lines, shoulder to shoulder. Cavalry charged knee to knee with sabres raised, as they'd done on battlefields 100 years earlier. There were a few very primitive aircraft, mainly in reconnaissance roles, and no tanks. Both sides were overwhelmingly armed with rifles. 4 years later, the battlefield had been transformed. Steel-helmeted combat teams rushed forward, protected by a curtain of artillery shells. They were now armed with flamethrowers, portable machine guns, and grenades fired from underneath rifles. Above them, planes, which were unimaginably more sophisticated than those of 1914, jeweled in the skies. Some carried experimental wireless radio sets, reporting real-time reconnaissance and even targeting the artillery. Those huge guns fired with pinpoint accuracy, using only aerial photos and maths. They could score a hit with the first shot.
Yeah, the amount of aerial photography and the detailed level at which they understood the map of the enemy trench lines and things like that is incredible. And yeah, I mean, just the nature of, think about it, for thousands of years, high ground was everything. And at the early stages of this war, it was as well. But as the war went on, high ground became less and less important because you could build pillboxes and you could send planes to be able to get the vantage point and spot for your artillery. You didn't have to have the highest ground anymore to be able to protect and to be able to spot. The tactics changed. You had infiltration tactics. You had the Germans using stormtroopers, for example. So not only is the technology constantly changing, but the use and combined arms for the first time is becoming a real thing.
The troops might be supported by armoured fighting vehicles. Tanks had armour plating which allowed them to withstand small arms fire, while tracks meant they could traverse the smashed landscape and crush barbed wire. The pace of change is reflected by the fact that the tank went from the drawing board to the battlefield in just 2 years.
Yeah.
First, heading across no man's land at the Battle of the Somme in September 1916.
Fleur Courcelette.
Everyone who fought in it hated it. This one...
Not Adrien Carton de Viart. He loved the war. He said he did.
But the truth is that some people enjoy war.
Yeah.
Like all conflicts, it comes down to luck. You may witness unimaginable horrors that leave you mentally and physically incapacitated for the rest of your life. Or you might get away without a scratch. It could be the best of times, it could be the worst of times. Bit of both, or neither. Some soldiers enjoyed the First World War. If they were lucky, they would avoid a big offensive. They might get posted somewhere quiet where conditions would actually be better than they might have experienced at home. For the British, there was meat every day, a rare luxury back home. There were cigarettes, tea and rum, part of a daily diet of more than 4,000 calories. Remarkably, absentee rates due to sickness, which is an important barometer of a unit's morale, were hardly above those of peacetime. Many young men enjoyed the guaranteed pay, the intense camaraderie, the responsibility, greater sexual freedom that they'd had in peacetime Britain. Pay for a British infantryman was about £1 a day, perhaps around a half as much as an agricultural labour might get, but food and accommodation was free, and there was guaranteed work year-round. There was intense comradeship. Men and women felt like they were engaged in a mighty joint effort. A war poet wrote, "I adore war. It's like a big picnic, but without the objectivelessness of a picnic. I have never been more well or more happy." An Italian writer, Emilio Lusu, watched a film which was based on his autobiographical novel about the war. He objected that it was too grim. "That's not all there is to war," he said. "Sometimes we even sang, joked, and dreamed our dreams."
Some of the most incredible works of art in terms of writing, poetry, and things like that came out of that war. I mean, it's beautiful stuff. It inspired, some of the war diaries that men kept are just incredible and moving. The way that each person processed what they were facing is unique to the person. And so, yeah, for some people, it was the worst thing they could ever have experienced in their lives. Other people came back with fond memories of it.
A Canadian veteran wrote that war was the greatest adventure of my life, the memories of which will remain with me for the remainder of my days, and I would not have missed it for anything.
Wow.
No one won.
The Allies won.
Swathes of Europe lay wasted, millions were dead or wounded, survivors lived on with severe mental trauma. Even some of the victorious powers were pretty much bankrupt.
Oh, look who made an appearance in the video. Anyway.
The fighting was rumbling on across Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Like most wars, it did not lead to a lasting and satisfactory peace. So it's a bit odd to talk about winning. But in a narrow military sense, the French, the Brits, the Americans and the Allies had convincingly won.
Yep.
Germany...
Listen, I think sometimes people who don't study the war in any great depth hear the word armistice and they think that it was just basically a white peace, that basically everybody just said, okay, we're going to stop fighting now. But no, we use that word, but the Treaty of Versailles was a surrender document. The armistice was a surrender. The Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Ottomans, they absolutely were defeated and surrendered in this war.
Battleships had been bottled up by the Royal Navy until their crews mutinied. Germany's army collapsed under a series of mighty Allied blows, which smashed through supposedly impregnable defences. By late September 1918, the German Emperor and his military mastermind Erich Ludendorff admitted that there was no hope for Germany and they must beg for peace.
Yeah, in September. It was September. The war doesn't end till November. And we've talked about this in a lot of detail on Stories of the Great War. When I did my video reviewing All Quiet on the Western Front, we talk a lot of detail about how that all went down at the end.
The 11th of November armistice was essentially a German surrender.
100%.
The Austro-Hungarian armies collapsed on the Italian front and in the Balkans. the empire was torn apart by revolution. Allied forces marched on Constantinople and Turkey surrendered. The Central Powers lost the First World War.
Yep.
The Allies achieved their political ends through violence, which is what war is all about. The British had fought to defend Belgian sovereignty, and in 1918, Belgium was once again an unoccupied free country. Britain also wanted to neutralise the German naval threat. By Christmas 1918, the German battle fleet was a prisoner in a British naval base.
Yeah, a lot of it was up at Scapa Flow, which is in Orkney. And there's this whole thing that nobody talks about. I think it was in the summer of 1919 where you had a bunch of German sailors who basically scuttled the fleet, and some of them were executed for it. And some of those ships are still there today in Scapa Flow. It's a really cool place to visit if you ever get the chance. Yeah, everything he said, 100% true.
The French had wanted the Germans out of France. They achieved this. They even immediately got back 2 provinces which the Germans had taken off them in the mid-19th century. And the Germans agreed to station no troops at all in the Rhineland, the German borderland with France. The Americans were happy to see every single German submarine surrendered to the Allies.
In fact, when the initial meeting happens at Compiègne, which would lead to the armistice, basically what happens is the German delegation shows up and says, we need to negotiate, an end to this war. And Ferdinand Foch, who's the Allied commander-in-chief, hands them a list of demands and says, you want to end the war? Agree to all these demands. Well, the problem was some of the demands couldn't be met because they were impossible. For example, they demanded a certain number of German U-boats be turned over to the Allies. Well, the Germans didn't even have that many U-boats to turn over.
Forget Serbia. The war had begun when Austria-Hungary had invaded Serbia way back in 1914. Well, now Serbia was once again independent. Ultimately, the German and Austro-Hungarian empires no longer existed by Christmas 1918. The Turkish Empire was occupied, partitioned, and would also be gone within a couple of years. That's losing.
Yep.
The Treaty of Versailles was so harsh. The myth goes that the Treaty of Versailles was so harsh that it left Germany humiliated, angry, hobbled, motivating the Germans to rearm and throw off this unjust yoke. But it just doesn't stand up. The Allies confiscated 10% of Germany's territory, but left it the largest, richest nation in Central Europe. The country was largely unoccupied, and financial reparations were linked to its ability to pay, which mostly went unenforced anyway. The treaty was notably less harsh than the 2 treaties that ended the wars either side of the First World War. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71.
He's 100% right about that, and this is often something people point to as an argument against the Treaty of Versailles being harsh, is that, well, what the Germans put on the French was even worse, which is 100% true.
And World War II. The German victors in the Franco-Prussian War had annexed 2 large chunks of 2 rich French provinces, part of France between 200 and 300 years, and home to most of French iron ore production.
But to be fair, that was land that had been fought over for centuries between the Germans and the French.
They'd also presented France with a massive bill for immediate payment. After World War II, Germany was occupied. It was split into different countries. Its factories, its machinery smashed, stolen. Millions of prisoners forced to stay with their captors and work as slave labourers. After World War II, Germany lost all the territory it had lost after World War I, and another giant slice on top of that. Yet we don't talk about the post-World War II treaty being overly harsh. Also, the treaty with the Turks was much harsher. The majority of Turkish territory, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, Arabia, all taken over by the British and French or made into independent countries. The Turkish Empire had been over 600,000 square miles in size in 1914, and it was reduced by half.
Now, to be fair, the Ottoman Empire, they were headed that direction anyway. They had been losing territory. They'd been steadily on the decline. That's why they called them the sick man of Europe.
And like Germany, Turkey was also not allowed a big army, powerful battleships, or an air force. The treaty was also nowhere near as harsh as the treaty inflicted on the Russians in 1918, when it looked like the Germans had won the First World War in the East. The German victors forced Russia to hand over control of Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, its Baltic provinces, and land in the Caucasus. These territories comprised 34% of the Russian Empire's former population and 54% of its industry, 89% of its coal fields, and a quarter of its railways. That treaty was savage. Versailles was not particularly tough on Germany, but it was portrayed as such by Hitler, who saw that he could blame anything that was wrong in Germany on the Treaty of Versailles, on those evil, cruel foreign powers. He then rode this tidal wave of anti-Versailles resentment all the way into power.
Yeah. I have a hard time arguing with anything he said there.
The First World War completely reshaped the world. Ancient empires were destroyed, new countries were born, and also new imperial ambitions. A lot of the myth-making around the war was born from the enormous disappointment that this huge, costly conflict did not lead to any lasting peace. The outbreak of the Second World War meant that many people saw the first as a pointless, destructive precursor to an even greater war.
Yeah, and I've said this before too. I think so much of why World War I is viewed the way it is because it's viewed through the lens of World War II. Take away World War II, I think people probably see it much differently.
But it deserves to be remembered in its own right as a global conflict and one of astonishing technological change.
That was great. That was fantastic. It was well produced, obviously. It was well put together, well communicated, but also incredibly factually correct. I really have no dispute with anything he said in that entire video. Let me know your thoughts, though, in the comment section below. Tell me what you think. And please do check out Stories of the Great War. I've got a lot of specific content, original content related to World War I there, and you can click on the link in the description. Thanks for watching.